Hello, Isaac here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Now, this is part 4 of a series going through Josephus's book Against Apion. So, please do subscribe, like and comment if you're enjoying this content. So, in the last video, we saw how Josephus responded to libels against the Jewish nation, particularly in relation to the Exodus account. Now, in this episode, Josephus will turn to Apion, offering the longest and most detailed response to the individual critic. He summarizes his efforts so far as follows. In the former book, my most esteemed Ephroditus, I demonstrated our antiquity, confirming the truth from the writings of Phoenicians, Chaldeans and Egyptians, and providing many Greek writers as witnesses. I also issued a counter-statement to Mattathyahu, Chareman and certain others. I shall now begin to refute the remaining authors who've written something against us, and in venturing a counter-statement against Apion the scholar, it occurred to me to wonder whether it was necessary to make the effort. Therefore, Josephus wonders if he even ought to provide a response to Apion, and one of the reasons is that he repeats many of the falsehoods as others. But given that many people were captivated by his work, he could hardly leave this man unscrutinized. Moreover, as he writes, he composed a charge against us as though in a lawsuit, which could have in mind the accusations brought against the Alexandrian Jews in the embassy to Gaius in 38 AD. Therefore, Josephus felt it necessary to provide a lengthy response to Apion and a treatise he had composed against the Jews. In terms of an outline, Josephus states that Apion's criticism leveled against the Jews covered 3 main topics. As he writes, some of what he says falls into the same category as the material that we have already scrutinized concerning the migration of our ancestors from Egypt. Some is a charge against Judeans who reside in Alexandria. Thirdly, there is mixed up with these a charge concerning the ritual practiced in our temple and the rest of our rules. The first of this topic we will turn to now, Apion's scrutiny of the migration from Egypt. And given that Josephus had already extensively covered this topic previously with the accounts of Mattathyahu and others, he will only briefly address what Apion adds to this story. Therefore, Apion repeat the same story as Mattathyahu, that the Judeans were a leprous people expelled from Egypt. But in terms of what Apion adds to the story is a different date for the Exodus, which he states happened in the first Olympiad, the year in which the Phoenicians founded Carthage. Josephus notes that this is demonstrably false, for even if you believe only the Phoenician records, this is when King Solomon already reigned over Judea, which is long after they had left Egypt. The next story Apion relates is how the Sabbath got its name. According to Apion, when they had travelled 6 days in the desert after leaving Egypt, they contracted swellings in the groin, and for this reason they called that day Sabbaton, which Apion states derives from the Egyptian language from sabbatosis, which means inflammation of the groin. Josephus ridicules this claim, writing, would not anyone either laugh at such nonsense, alternatively detest the effrontery in writing such things? Obviously, all 110,000 contracted such inflammation of the groin, but if they were blind and lame and sick in every way, such as Apion says they were, they would not have been able to make even 1 day's journey. And if they were able to cross an extensive desert and moreover defeat those who opposed them, all taking part in the fight, they were not afflicted en masse with groin swelling after the 6th day. Besides the absurdity of the scenario of Judeans crossing an extensive desert from Egypt to Judea in just 6 days, which the biblical account says took 40 years, Josephus points to the inconsistency even in Apion between a supposed 6-day journey and his account of a 40-day delay while Moses was on Mount Sinai. Moreover, Josephus simply points to the true etymology of the Hebrew Shabbat, which means rest from work, and has no connection to this Egyptian word sabo. Interestingly though, many Greco-Roman authors tried to find the same connection between the Sabbath and the Exodus. For example, Plutarch alludes to a 7-day flight from Egypt, and Tacitus has the Judeans arrive and rest after a 6-day crossing. The novelty for Apion is the use of etymology to find some Egyptian roots for the Hebrew language, given that they came from Egypt originally. In fact, this has become an interesting area of study as of late, especially providing support for the Hebrew's origins in Egypt. For example, Benjamin J. Noonan has identified 381 total occurrences of Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus and wilderness traditions. In his 2016 article, he concludes, 3 salient points emerge. First, the Exodus and wilderness traditions contain significantly higher proportions of Egyptian terminology than the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Proportions comparable to the high proportions of old Iranian terminology of the books of Esther and Ezra Nehemiah that reflect foreign influence. Second, the Exodus and wilderness traditions contain significantly higher proportions of Egyptian terminology than other Northwest Semitic texts, with the exception of Imperial Aramaic texts that exhibit intense Egyptian contact. Third, at least some of the Egyptian loanwords found in the Exodus and wilderness narratives were borrowed during the Late Bronze Age, and it's likely that many of the other loanwords were also borrowed then. Therefore, Apion seems to be on the mark at least in terms of looking for Egyptian loanwords in the Hebrew language, even if the connection between the Hebrew Shabbat and the Egyptian Sabo is incorrect. Next, Josephus moves on to address Apion's slander directed towards the Alexandrian Jews. Firstly, there is a general denigration of the Jews in Alexandria, as they were of low status and live in one of the least desirable locations in the city. For Apion says that they came from Syria, probably during the Ptolemaic period, and took up residence on the harbourless shore next to the floating wreckage of ships and cargo which the sea brought in. Josephus' response, however, is that this is not so much a criticism of the Jews, but of Alexandria itself, for he says that all acknowledge that this is the finest residential quarter in the city. As he writes, the location is a matter of insult. He is insulting not his own home city, but the one he professes to be such, Alexandria. For the seaboard is part of that city and is, as all acknowledge, the finest residential quarter. Not only is it the finest residential quarter, but is given to the Judeans by Alexander the Great, presumably on the basis of their support for him. Nonetheless, the main criticism for Apion is that the Jews have no right to be called Alexandrian citizens. This is the issue at the heart of the Alexandrian riots of 38 AD. For the governor of Egypt, Flaccus, according to Philo of Alexandria, removed their citizenship rights in the city and announced that they were foreigners and aliens. And by the removal of the governor Flaccus by the Emperor Gaius, the Jewish and Greek-Egyptian sides appointed delegations to go to Rome. The Greek side was led by Apion himself, and he sought to secure an imperial decree keeping the Jews in their underprivileged position to which Flaccus had relegated them. Now, regarding Alexandrian citizenship and their Jewish rights and privileges in the city, Josephus tells Apion to read the letters of Alexander the King and Ptolemy son of Lagus, as well as his successors as kings of Egypt, and lastly, the monument that stands in Alexandria and records the rights that Caesar the Great gave to the Judeans. For Josephus, there are really two options. As he writes, if he had read the documents of his successors as kings of Egypt, and the monument that stands in Alexandria and records the rights that Caesar the Great gave to the Judeans, if, I say, he knew all these things but had the effrontery to contradict them, he was malicious. If he knew none of them, he was ignoramus. To add to this, Josephus will provide a brief survey of the history of the relations between the Jews and the rulers of Egypt, to show that their political rights in Alexandria retained from its founding, as well as the political loyalty of the Judeans and the admiration shown by the rulers of Egypt towards them. Josephus begins with Alexander the Great, who granted the Judean people citizenship of Alexandria because of the loyalty and kindness they had shown towards him. According to Josephus, his successor Ptolemy, son of Lagus, held similar views towards the Judean people. In fact, he trusted Judeans in Egypt so much that he entrusted them to the fortresses, reckoning that they would guard them loyally and nobly. His successor, Ptolemy Philadelphus, set free any Judeans that happened to be prisoners of war, and he was enthusiastic to know their laws and read their holy writings. In fact, he entreated that the Torah should be translated into the Greek tongue from Hebrew, and so 70 Jewish scholars undertook the task, creating what we know as Septuagint in the 3rd century BC, which would have been deposited in the Great Library at Alexandria. Next, he moves on to Ptolemy III, called Euergetes. He won the whole of Syria by force, but he did not sacrifice thank offerings to the Egyptian gods, but came to Jerusalem, where he dedicated votive offerings for the victory. This favourable approach to the Judean people in Egypt further continued under Ptolemy Philometor. In fact, the wife of Philometor, Cleopatra, made 2 Judeans, Ananias and Dositheus, commanders of the whole army. Nonetheless, Apion has a problem with Ananias and Dositheus, who presented Ananias' actions as against the city of Alexandria, Ptolemy's fiscun, and the interests of Rome. Josephus, however, defends these 2 Judeans as peacemakers. Now, for some context, Ptolemy fiscun, after the death of his brother Ptolemy Philometor in 145 BC, set out from Cyrene with the intention of expelling the wife of Ptolemy Philometor, Cleopatra, as well as their children, so that he could acquire the kingdom for himself. But Ananias waged a war against Ptolemy fiscun on behalf of Cleopatra out of loyalty to the king and to prevent this injustice. His actions were, according to Josephus, fully justified, and were neither an attack on Alexandria, Egypt, or Rome. Therefore, providing historical outline for Judean citizenship in Alexandria from its founding, as well as the favourable approach to them by the rulers of Egypt, Josephus will address Apion's proof that the Jews in Alexandria were not citizens of the city, but merely foreigners. For Apion, this proof rests on the fact that they were left out of the civic grain distribution by both Cleopatra and Germanicus, and by their refusal to participate in the civic cults. First then, Apion draws on the actions of the last queen of Alexandria, Cleopatra VII, who reigned from 51 to 30 BC until she was disposed of her position by Octavian and Egypt turned into a Roman province. Apion seems to draw on the treatment of the Judeans by Cleopatra to indict the Jews. The issue at hand is that the Judeans were not included in the grain distribution in Alexandria during the food shortage, which Apion believes is proof that the Judeans were not citizens of the city. Josephus, however, turns this around as a mark of credit that they were insulted by so wicked a woman. Instead, he tells Apion that he ought to use his energy to indict Cleopatra, who was steeped in every kind of injustice and criminal activity against her close relation, her husbands who used to love her, and in general against all Romans and the commanders, her benefactors. Besides this, the fact that Cleopatra refused to provide a grain distribution for Judeans is irrelevant when it comes to Alexandrian citizenship, for the Judeans' loyalty and support to Caesar, as well as their citizenship of the city, is attested by the Senate and its decrees and letters from Caesar Augustus. But Apion also brings up the actions of Germanicus, who also excluded Judeans from the grain distribution in Alexandria. Germanicus visited Egypt in 19 AD, just before he died, and according to Tacitus at least, he gained favour by opening the granaries and lowering the price of grain. And access to this cheap grain was probably restricted to Alexandrian citizens. But Josephus likewise dismisses this claim, stating that the reason Judeans did not participate was not because they were not considered citizens, but that there was simply not enough grain to go around. In other words, it's an indictment as to the failure of the crops and the shortage of grain, rather than the Judeans and their citizenship status. The last issue for Apion as to why Judeans shouldn't be considered citizens of Alexandria is that they don't worship the same gods as them. Josephus, however, considers this to be somewhat hypocritical, given that Apion by birth is a native Egyptian, and Alexandria was not a site of traditional Egyptian worship, but was dominated by Greek rather than Egyptian traditions. Besides this, there are many differences of opinion among the Egyptians themselves regarding religion, and sources from the Roman era express great alarm for the violence which arose from competing animal cults in the Egyptian countryside. Josephus notes that Apion places the responsibility of the civil unrest of 38 AD on the Judean population. Instead though, Josephus blames it on Alexandrian citizens of Apion's sort. For at the beginning it was only Greeks and Macedonians who possessed citizenship of the city of Alexandria, but they mixed with native Egyptians, and as such they adopted the malicious habits of the Egyptians and their ancient hostility towards the Judeans. In this, Josephus turns Apion's argument against him, for it was thought that Judeans were antisocial because they didn't mix with non-Judeans. But in fact, according to Josephus, the mixing of Greeks and Egyptians in Alexandria had resulted in a disharmony. Finally, Apion denounced the Jews because they did not set up statues of the emperor, which is the issue that came to the fore with the Emperor Gaius Caligula, who attempted to set up a statue of himself in a temple in Jerusalem. The defense from Josephus is that the Romans do not compel their subjects to transgress their ancestral laws, and accept such honours as it is pious and legitimate for their donors to accept. Therefore, the worship of the emperor as though he were a god is prohibited for the Judeans, but this does not mean that they didn't pay homage with other honours, for they offered perpetual sacrifices to God for the emperor, and this exceptional honour was not rendered to any other human being. Okay, this ends Josephus' defense of the citizenship and political rights of the Jewish population of Alexandria. Now, given the length of the critique of Apion, we'll have to continue Josephus' response to him in the next video, where he will address charges concerning rituals practiced in the Jerusalem temple and the Jewish law. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!